Thank you very much, Dean Guerin, Professor Frederick, Executive Director Mona Frederick. It's a pleasure and honor to be here today. This is my first visit to Nashville, so I always love to get a sense of another place. So now I know that you're the folks who roll with weather that changes every 15 minutes. But it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I want to tell some stories to start about how the book Cuz came into existence. Partly because as I was walking over here, I learned that the lecturer for this event last year was a playwright named Chiara Alegria Hudes. And some of you may have been here. I guess probably not all of you were. But Chiara is an extraordinary playwright. She was somebody who, by the age of, I think, 32, had already been nominated for a Pulitzer 3 times. And she won the 3rd time, so 3 times the charm is the trick. She wrote the book for Lin-Manuel Miranda's first musical called In the Heights. You may not know that one because you all know Hamilton, but In the Heights is pretty good too. Chiara is an amazingly talented person, and I was lucky some time ago, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years perhaps. I was giving a set of very academic lectures at Stanford. I'm a political philosopher fundamentally, as you heard in the introduction. And I was giving a set of lectures under the title Education and Equality. I was trying to figure out what that connection is between those two concepts. We so often immediately, when we think about that topic, think about issues of material equality or economic opportunity, and I wanted to get at something else, a question of how education empowers people as citizens. That was the kind of equality I was interested in. And I gave these quite philosophical, abstract lectures. They're the Tanner lectures, they're called. And the thing about these lectures is you get to have commentators immediately afterwards, and Chiara was one of the commentators. So I had 3 academics and a playwright commenting on my lectures. And Chiara gave an essay, which was a story about her cousin in prison, I think in upstate New York at the time. She had grown up in urban Philadelphia and had a lot of cousins in prison. And as she was talking about the exchanges between herself and her cousin around her cousin's effort to become a writer, to learn and so forth, I was just weeping. I was sitting there, I was supposed to be getting my comments, preparing to respond to my comments, and I just found myself dissolving. And in that moment, I said, in my comments afterwards, there's a world of cousins, isn't there? There's a world of cousins whose stories we don't tell. And so that was, Chiara was already a friend. She was somebody I respected and admired, but that was a special bond between us. And when she came here last year, I understand she shared a piece of work, her own project about her cousins. And we've actually been traveling together in a bit of a journey to start to tell the stories of our cousins. And so that's one piece of the origin story of this book, Cuz, as it's called. The other piece has a related valence to it. I was invited, again, an incredible honor, to give a set of lectures at Harvard called the Du Bois Lectures. These are named after the early 20th century African-American sociologist and political thinker, W.E.B. Du Bois. The job of somebody who gives these lectures is to offer a comment on the state of affairs for African-Americans in the contemporary U.S. And I was asked by Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., you'll know his roots sequence and documentaries and his genealogical work. Skip is what those of us who've known him for a long time call him. So Skip invited me to give these lectures. And again, it was a tremendous opportunity. And of course, I said yes. And every time the date came for them, I kept canceling, deferring. And I kept giving Skip these really abstract titles, Race and Justice in 21st Century America, or Equality in African Americans. And finally I realized, that there was a reason I kept canceling. We sort of reached this point where Professor Gates said to me, look, kid, you can't keep canceling, you're going to have to give these lectures. And that forced a sort of moment of self-awareness where I realized that I couldn't possibly pretend to stand up in front of a group of people and offer a comment on the state of affairs for African Americans in this country in the 21st century without understanding and telling the story of my cousin Michael. So I did. I dug into his story, which I'll tell you in a minute. I know I'm withholding it. And found myself giving what were probably the strangest lectures in Harvard's history. So 3 lectures, one day after the next, and I wept through all 3 lectures. Because my cousin's story was something I had never talked about. My family had never talked about it with each other. That's sort of the worst part of the story. And so the sharing was a working through, but it was a necessary thing to do. Now, the common thread in those two stories is that this makes this book a coming out story. All right? We're used to thinking about coming out stories about people who've been in the closet in terms of their sexual identity. But there's another kind of coming out story that this country needs. 2.5 million people are in prison right now. Another 5 million are under direct surveillance or supervision of the criminal justice system, meaning they're on parole or probation or something of the sort. 7 million people are directly in the criminal justice system at the moment. This has been true for more than a decade, the numbers at that level. Okay, so that's a lot of people. Each of those people is connected, we can imagine, to at least 4 other people, maybe 6 people, maybe 10. Obviously, there's some overlap in those numbers. But nonetheless, we have to imagine that somewhere 20, 30 million Americans have direct experience of the criminal justice system in the country. How many of those stories have you heard? Silence. Don't hear those stories. 20 to 30 million stories of what our criminal justice system does. That scale of a criminal justice system, the world has never seen. Okay? You heard in the introduction, I'm a historian and political philosopher. My first book was on punishment in ancient Athens. The reason I wrote a book about punishment in ancient Athens is because I grew up in Los Angeles in the 70s and 80s. And all around me, prisons were growing, 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 growing. The news was full of people going to jail, prisons growing, growing, growing. And I went to college at Princeton, and I took a class on Athenian democracy in my second year. And so this is for all the undergraduates in the room. I was reading all these texts from Athenian courts, speeches, law speeches, prosecutions, defense, all this material from the Athenian court system. And one day in class, I asked a question. I said, didn't these people use prison? Because there was almost no mention of prison anywhere in this vast corpus. And my professor said, that would make a great dissertation topic. Now, why did I ask that question? I asked that question because this ancient world looks so different from the one I was used to, but it looked different to me because I'd grown up in Los Angeles in the 70s and the 80s. It's not a question that anybody, everybody else might necessarily have asked. So the point of that is that the questions that you bring to college with you are important questions. Young people register features of our world before older people do. And the questions that young people have are critical to understanding the shape of how our world is presently changing. Okay? So I asked that question, and my professor, and this was before my cousin got involved in the criminal justice system, my professor said that would be a great dissertation topic, and lo and behold, I went off to work on that. And so starting in the late 80s, I was trying to understand how punishment worked around the world across centuries. And so for that reason, I can say with complete authority that the world has never seen a penal system, a system of incarceration on the scale that this country has built. Okay? It's one of the things that counts as a part of American exceptionalism. And we have to register that and face it. There's lots more to say about that, and I'll come back to that, and we can talk about that in the questions section too. But I want to now share with you the story of my cousin, who went to prison in 1995. So that was about 4 years after I'd asked my professor this question. He went to prison in Los Angeles in South Central. And I want to tell you his story. Before I give you too many more details of what happened to him, I'm also going to ask you a question. So we all grew up in California, as I said. We're part of a big extended family. My dad had grown up in northern Florida in a family with 12 brothers and sisters, and a good chunk of the family of the siblings had moved to Southern California in pursuit of opportunity. It appeared in the time when my dad's sort of political awakening was the Emmett Till lynching, for example. The South was a very difficult place for a young African-American man. They'd gone to Southern California seeking new possibilities. And there, my father became a college professor. My aunt, my dad's name is William, my aunt Karen was a single mother. She had left the father of her 3 children, who was physically abusive, and also moved to Los Angeles to join this other cluster of family members. And we were very close in the sense of big family gatherings, lots of kids playing together, all kinds of ages running around together. Karen struggled as a single mom. Her brothers and sisters helped her out. Her 3 kids, Nicholas, Michael, and Rosalind, were often in our house. And I like to say we were like 5 porch steps. We were all 18 months younger than the other, like one after the other. Irish twins is another sort of kind of name for that spacing. And I was the oldest of that group of 5, so I was the bossy cousin, right, in that group of cousins. And Michael was an incredibly bright-spirited, charismatic kid, big, beautiful smile. He always lit up the room. He loved to be outdoors. He had a real hunger to be outside and move around. He also loved school, so he was passionate, actually, about funny things, like he wanted to learn French. Sort of not entirely clear where a sort of strong desire to learn French came from, but that was one of the things that he loved. And in general, he was really good at talking to other people, working with other people. He used to do things like sell peanuts at sort of stands and door to door as a part of a program to raise money to go to summer camp. And he could raise enough money selling peanuts to take his brother and sister with him to summer camp as well. And so this was the sort of Southern California childhood where we'd play football in the city streets with each other, run around riding bikes up and down hills, and this sort of thing. When Michael was about 10, his mother met and fell in love with somebody and got married. So seems like sort of the single mother's dream. She'd been progressively moving up in the world, gets married. They decide LA feels dangerous, it feels like there's lots of threats to the kids. They decide to move back to where her new husband had grown up. So they move back to Mississippi. And there they discover, in fact, that this new husband had himself come out of a world of great violence, was still entangled in vendettas of various kinds, and he turned out to be himself quite physically abusive. And over a period of 5 years, basically, so altogether 5 years, but 3 years, the family sort of came apart. There were lots of moves as Karen's trying to figure out how to deal with the situation, how to get out of that difficulty. And over this period of time, they moved to Mississippi, and then Georgia, and then several places in Georgia, and then finally back to California when Karen was on her own again. And over that period of time, Michael had sort of 5 mid-year school transitions, landed back in Southern California. And then, just a few more pieces here, we get to a moment where Karen's apartment in the college town that I had grown up in catches on fire. Burns. You discover when you pay attention to experiences of poverty that one issue after another follows on. They pile up. It's very hard to stop chains of events. And when this happens, and they're all briefly homeless, Karen decides that since her job is in Los Angeles, she's been commuting 35 miles to get back and forth to her job, that she'll go ahead and move back into LA. So she moves into South Central. And so Michael lands in South Central as a 14-year-old without social connections or affiliations there at a period in the early 90s when it is at its high point of violence in recent history. The drug trade has been exploding, gangs have been exploding, general levels of violence have been exploding. So this is where Michael lands. And suddenly, in the fall of 1995, he's arrested for the first time. And it comes out of the blue for all of us. He had, before the arson issue in Claremont, the town we grew up in, he had a shoplifting incident, okay? And he had also had another theft of a radio from a neighbor. So he had been flirting with bad behavior. And then suddenly there's an arrest for a terrible set of incidents. It comes out of the blue. He's arrested for an attempted carjacking, okay? And this attempted carjacking happens on a Sunday morning. There's a gentleman outside in South Central LA washing his Cadillac in the back of an alley. Michael has a gun. He holds the man up. He asks for the watch and wallet. The man hands those over. There's nothing in the wallet. Michael asks for the car. The gentleman wrestles the gun away from Michael and shoots Michael in the neck. So that's how the attempted carjacking ends. Police come, take him to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, he as you might imagine, confesses to what's just happened. That's straightforward. He also shares that in the past week, he's robbed 4 other people at gunpoint. All right? Again, this comes as a complete surprise. There's been nothing like this in his history up until that point. It's a week of serious violence. All right. So, here's my question for you. I'm going to ask you a strange question, and I'm actually going to give you just a minute to think about it, and then I'm going to give you a minute to talk to each other, and then I'm going to continue telling my story. Okay? Now my question is, I've told you a lot about Michael's story. I haven't told you all the details of his story as of yet, but I've told you it's a reasonable representation. If you read my book, you'll see I haven't left out any major components of his childhood. So how should Michael be punished? He's clearly done something seriously wrong. No question about it. He's done something seriously wrong. How should he be punished? I want you to spend a minute thinking about that question, but here's the catch. You're not allowed to give the answer prison. Okay? And I'll explain why I'm asking you this question a little later. But for now, I just want you to try to think about how should we respond to Michael's wrongdoing, and you're not allowed to say prison. So I'll just give you a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to turn to your neighbor and try to answer that question. And then I will carry on. And while you're thinking about that, you could also ask yourself, if you have trouble answering it, you can ask yourself, what would I want to know more about in order to answer this question? Okay? Alrighty. Thank you. Thank you. So now the question is, are there a couple of brave souls who are willing to share a little bit about what you talked about with your neighbor? And you might share what was hard about answering that question or what your answer was, any piece of it. So, brave soul. Let's see, brave soul here. Thank you.
Yeah, I said some sort of restorative justice program, a way that which to be fairly committed to something non-violent. It's nothing sinister. I believe that his motivation is more poverty related than it was wanting to do harm or hurt people. So I think a sort of program that would educate him or rehabilitate him, understand that there are other ways to exist, there are other ways to get out of that kind of lifestyle.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. That's a rich answer. Other thoughts? It's supposed to be a hard question to answer. You made it sound easy to answer. It's supposed to be a hard question to answer. Thank you for that. Yes. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts over here? Yep.
Partnership with a mentor at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Similar background, shared experience, be more relatable.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you for digging in and engaging on these questions. I'd like to ask this question, and you guys actually had a lot more substantive things to say already than often is the case when I ask that question. Because very often the question just creates a blank space in people's imagination. If we don't use prison, what on earth do we do? And there's a reason that we have that blank space, have trouble thinking about alternatives. So in this country, 70% of our criminal justice sanctions are incarceration. All right? In Germany, 6% of their sanctions are incarceration. In the Netherlands, 10%. So there are actually different ways of thinking about wrongdoing. And I'll come back to that in a second, and some of it is about restorative justice. I'll come back to what the alternatives are in a minute, but I want to tell you what, in fact, happened to Michael and say a little bit more about his story. So it was 1995. Michael was 15. 2 years earlier, California had passed the first 3 strikes you're outlaw in the country. Now, people often don't know that you can get more than 1 strike in a single incident. So Michael's attempted carjacking plus the wallet and the watch were 2 strikes. And the other things he confessed to were an additional 2 strikes. That's the way they were charging him. So he was facing 4 strikes. And the judge informed him that if he went to trial and was convicted, because of mandatory sentencing on 3 strikes, he would get 25 years to life. So he faced a choice about whether to take a plea deal, plead guilty instead of going to trial in court at a hearing about the charges. And he didn't know what to do, so he asked his mother to decide. So she went outside the courtroom and prayed and thought in her prayers that he should plead guilty and would likely get a sentence of about 7 years. She just, had no basis for that. That's just what she imagined to her felt fair, or something like that. Anyway, so she went in, advised that he should plead guilty. He did, and he got 12 years and 8 months from age 15. The judge who sentenced him wrote to the corrections system and recommended that he be kept in the juvenile system until the maximum age possible, which at that time in California was 25. For reasons that cannot be recovered, he was instead sent to adult facilities at the moment he turned 17. His first adult facility was on the Oregon border. His mother was in Los Angeles. She wasn't able to get there at all for visits during those first 6 months. Everybody knows that the single thing that makes the biggest difference for people in terms of re-entering effectively is family contact. Anyway, Michael served his time. He never caught another charge in prison, which is extraordinary. Actually, it's very hard to make it through 11 years without getting some other kind of charge just because there's so much violence in the prison itself, which says something about who he was. He sought out education. It was hard because California had stripped education out of the prisons at the time, and soon the 1994 federal criminal bill took Pell Grants out of access, took them away from access to prisoners. But we found him some correspondence college courses. I worked on that with him. And at any rate, was, as I say, the cousin on duty when he was released in 2006. And I won't tell you the whole story now about what happened on his release, but the short of it is he was killed 3 years after he was released by the lover he'd met in prison. So his original sentence at 15 was his whole future. And I could tell you, I will share a little bit about Michael in just a minute. I'll read you a little bit of his voice because he was a brilliant writer. He did love school. He was good at school. He was in an advanced high school pre-college program at this point when he got into trouble at 15. And the courses he did in college meant a lot to him. And I'll read you a little bit. I've got some of his essays in the book. And that was another motivation for writing the book. I had this box of his letters and essays and so forth, and we always thought he would tell his own story. And so for years, his box was like voice trapped there, pulsing, needing to get out. So that's my favorite part of the book. I feel like my job was just to provide a setting so that Michael's voice could get out. But let me come back to the question I asked you about approaches to punishment and comparisons. There's so much more to be said here about why our criminal justice system is the way it is, and we could spend a lot of time talking about the war on drugs, which I take to be a major part of the story, and I hope you might ask me some questions about that, but I will reserve that subject for the moment and just focus on this issue of how we respond to wrongdoing, where the goal should be that the victim be made whole, the community be made whole, and the wrongdoer be made whole. And one label for this approach is restorative justice, as the gentleman over here mentioned earlier. But another key part of this is something called the principle of association, which is the principle that the folks in Germany and the Netherlands have used to structure their criminal justice system. The basic idea is that human beings are social. People have known this for a very long time. That one goes back to Aristotle. Human beings are social creatures. And removing human beings from society is in itself already a punishment and is going to do them damage. Okay? So by definition, incarceration is a response to wrongdoing that damages the wrongdoer. That doesn't mean you shouldn't use it, but it means you should use it sparingly, understanding that you're actually making an already bad situation worse. The second feature of the principle of association is that if the goal is to make the victim whole, the community whole, and the wrongdoer whole, to be a healthy part of society, then what you need to do is build on the principle of association to help the wrongdoer become ready for positive and productive social relationships. That means building an experience on top of positive social relationships and giving the wrongdoer an opportunity to continue positive growth in their social relationships. What this often means in Germany and the Netherlands is things, for example, like work programs where people live in supervised housing. Okay, so there's a supervision of where they live in a halfway house or something of that sort, but they are able to go out in the day into apprenticeship programs or work programs of other kinds that give them the opportunity to develop skills. And they don't use solitary confinement. Okay, that's been taken out of their systems for the same sorts of principles. The lengths of their terms are much shorter than ours, too. So part of the reason we have so many people in prison is because of the lengths of our terms. But then, in addition, in terms of the character of the place where people live, in Germany, offenders are able to wear their own clothes, even inside incarceration, even when that's the penalty they're getting. They're permitted to work in groups that do things like cook together and work on maintaining a positive social unit together. And the guards are trained in the spirit of people whose job is to help them succeed at that collective living, not people who are trained to tear people down. I've written also about aspects of this as it happens in the context of the fire programs, for example, that we all saw in the California wildfires, that there were a lot of incarcerated people serving and working in those fires. And Michael had the chance to do that when he was in prison, and it was the best thing that happened to him while he was in prison. And those programs are important because they actually provide a nice example of this principle of association, where the incarcerated people are going out of the prison, they're trusted to be part of society, to do something productive to society, they do go back, but also most importantly, in effect, guards, who are the crew leaders, have a very different kind of motivation from a conventional prison guard. Their job is to make sure that those incarcerated people succeed as firefighters and succeed as a team. That takes a very different kind of training for those guards than the rest of the guards typically have. So that's just one concrete example of how the principle of association changes how you think about a whole structure of sanctions. So I want to invite you all to imagine that our world could be completely different than it is. All right? And in inviting you to imagine this, I'm not proposing something utopian, okay? Because, again, you can just get a plane ticket, I like to say, and go to Germany, and there it is. That world exists. all right, where incarceration is only used for 6% of sentences. All right? So, again, there's so much more to say, and I know you're going to have lots of questions, but let me just take a minute to share with you a little bit of Michael's voice, and then a wee little bit of my own voice, just so you have a sense of what it meant to try to tell this story. Because in these remarks, I've spent more time on policy. It's easier to talk in public about policy than about your own story, all right? So I wrap myself in that protection. So Michael wrote a beautiful, beautiful essay about Dante's Inferno. He called it Two Hells in Survival Finding Oneself. The Inferno is constructed like a prison. It is especially similar to the eighth circle. The souls are in pits which are guarded by beasts and demons. They are being punished in accordance to their sins on earth. Prison is the same way. The sins we committed as citizens are judged according to law, which is based on universal principles. We who are in prison had to answer for our sins, and our lives were taken from us. Our bodies became the property of the state of California. We are reduced to numbers and stripped of our identity. To the state of California, I am not Michael Alexander Allen, but I am K10033. When they want to know anything about me, they do not type my last name in the computer, but it is my number that is inputted. My number is my name. I am K10033. In Dante's Inferno, those who are inquired of are asked their names. Here is one of the differences between my hell in prison and the Inferno. The souls in the Inferno are called by name. To some, it may be a matter of filing, but to me, it is a means to keep anyone with the potential to be great mentally enslaved. In the very end of the essay, like Dante, I am forced to descend lower into hell to achieve a full awakening. I am forced into depression, scarred by obscenities, war after war. But each war that I survive, I am a step closer to a full awakening of self. My hell is no longer demonstrating what I am capable of doing in order to survive. It has become what I can tolerate and withstand in order to live. I cannot help but to judge those around me. I am one of them, but we are far from the same. Like Dante, I am cursed with a spirit of discernment, which allows us to see the truth for what it is. There are most whom I despise who are truly sick beyond healing, and they should never leave this place. Then there are those who await to fulfill their destiny. I see in them a sincere and apologetic heart for their ill misdeeds. They are the one who will change the world positively, or positively change someone's world. Hell cannot hold the latter of the two opposites, but in time will only spit them back out into society to do what is right. The hell that I live in cannot hold Dante. Hell can test and try oneself, but it cannot hold Dante, and it will not hold me. In the Inferno, the dead are trapped forever. Surely the biggest and most important difference in the Inferno and my hell called prison is that I have a way out. So I'll tell you, that's a bit about Michael, or his voice. I'll give you a little bit of myself now. Let's see. Okay. If many of my memories of Michael's time in prison involve coaching him over the phone through his writings about canonical texts, a good portion of the rest involve long visits with him, and most often with my Aunt Karen, in Norco's bare-bones visiting room and prison yard. Norco is the name of where he was for most of his years. These visits possessed an emotional rhythm. The sense of steeling yourself against the difficult as you started the early morning drive from LA, the rising anticipation as you got closer, the quiet joy of the visit, and the aching disappointment that inevitably came with departure, with leaving one's loved one still inside. Once one arrived at the prison, visits had an intensely ritualistic quality, the underlying purpose of which is control. You might want to say control of the inmates or control of their families, but that wouldn't seem quite right. The target of the rituals felt more indiscriminate. The object is simply control in its own right. Excuse me. As Michael, known to the system as K10033, wrote, Inmates went by numbers, not names. And visiting days were allocated to sets of numbers. Half of the evens on one Saturday, half of the odds on Sunday, the other halves of each set the following week. Before you could even begin to visit, you first had to apply for permission to enter. You had to get your name on the list. This could take months, and then the visits themselves were odysseys. We generally set out at about 4 or 5 in the morning in the half-dark of pre-dawn and drove straight toward the rising sun in order to get to the prison by 6:30 a.m. There we would join the line of waiting cars, snaking from the parking lot past a row of suburban baseball fields that bordered the prison. This was a good time for heart-to-hearts between Karen and me. What were her aspirations for her ministry? Who did she have living on her couch and why? What was happening with my marriage? There was a funny story about an earthquake hitting while she was high from a time decades earlier before she'd gotten sober. If we went on a Saturday, there would often be Little League games in play as we drove away past the fields in the afternoon. At 7:30 a.m., the guards would let a parade of Kias and Hyundais, Chevys, and Dodges into the parking lot. And then you would sign in at a lectern at the front of a canopied structure with wooden benches that looked like something of a tent revival meeting. Hosts of mainly black and brown women, but white women too, and many children, and some men, flitted in the shadows under the canopy. We could take in up to $30 in quarters or singles in plastic baggies, and we always took the maximum. The point of this was to purchase treats for the inmates from the row of vending machines dispensing, as it turned out, quite disgusting microwavable cheeseburgers and burritos, along with mystery meat plates. It also mattered how you dressed. You couldn't wear blue denim because that's what the inmates wore. You couldn't wear beige or khaki because that's what the guards wore. You couldn't wear tight clothes or clothes that showed cleavage, or skirts shorter than 2 inches above the knee, or sleeves shorter than 2 inches below the shoulder. If you were dressed wrong, you weren't let in. You always took a backup set of clothes just in case. If there was a target, if there was a focal point of the control, I suppose it was the attempt to target desire. Now, I'm going to read you a little bit more. I know I'm going long and I'm almost done, but I'm going to read you a bit more because my editor didn't like that chapter and wanted me to take it out. Okay? And you can tell I didn't take it out because here it is. All right? But we went back and forth over it. It took me a very long time to figure out what was wrong with the chapter. And if you were listening closely, you may have picked it up. But in the chapter, I use the pronoun you a lot. You do this, you do that. One does this, one does that. Not I. In the rest of the book, up until that point, I used I consistently. But somehow when I came to have to describe my visits, I couldn't do that. Even when I was working on telling this story, trying to be honest, I hit a point where I actually couldn't describe it from my own point of view. And that's what my editor kept saying. He kept saying, but you're not telling us about you, about your experience. You're not describing it from your point of view. And I kept saying, but I've got the $30 in the baggie. Like, that's a specific detail. Like, isn't that about me? And back and forth. So the result was a chapter called Visiting 2.0. Okay? Time for my own confession. I wrote that last chapter like an academic, which I am. The description of visiting that I gave you wasn't about me. It was about some disembodied you. To write that chapter, I stepped into the perspective of an outside observer, the luxury afforded to academics when they travel the world encountering pain and injustice. To be an academic is to acquire an excuse for not owning the pain you see. Take a look at what I wrote. Visits had an intense ritualistic quality, the underlying purpose of which is control. You might want to say control of the inmates or control of their families, but that wouldn't seem quite right. The target of the rituals is simply control in itself. Abstraction, distancing, those are my first tools of self-protection. Athena's spear and shield. I'll have to try again to describe what visiting Michael meant to me. The fact that I told the story as an academic already tells you everything you need to know. The wound of visiting Michael in prison goes so deep that somehow, even in writing this book, I have found it hard to own up to one simple fact. I went to prison. I was in prison. No, I don't mean I've been arrested or convicted of a crime. I have avoided that because thus far in life, I have had that combination of goods that the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle thought was necessary for a happy life. Resources, decent character, and luck. My father and mother gave me the first two items from that treasure chest. The Lord my God, whom I believed in as a child, and then did not believe in, and then came to believe in again as I emerged from periods of great pain, has given me the third. All right. So now you know more about me than anybody other than my husband. But no, I was not in prison as a convict, and this is thanks to my father, my mother, and my God. Yet even as someone who could come and go, I felt the prison's mark, its branding fork. I felt it in my soul, even though all I was there was a day's sojourner. Thank you. So, questions?
Thank you very much. And I got some questions, so please.
And feel free, any part of it, whether it's the story and the what happened part or the policy part, you're welcome to ask questions about any of it. Yeah.
So, obviously, I think the strategy in Germany and the Netherlands is a lot better than what we have here, and it's a lot more effective for all involved. But one thing that worries me about, America somehow magically moved toward that sort of approach. Like, I've read the new Jim Crow, and I worry that it would just become even more of a slave labor type of a situation where you have those just work as opposed to I feel like that's better now because connections are better for them. But what can you say, I suppose, to in America, how would it be from kind of returning to that?
Sure. No, thank you. Of course, absolutely. Yep. No, there's lots to say about that. So let me just give you a few other kind of broad context things that I think help us all think about this issue. So another way to think about what Germany and the Netherlands have is a second chance system. Okay? That you want to respond to wrongdoing in a way that gives people a meaningful second chance. Michael did not get a meaningful second chance. And this phrase is useful because it helps one see one of the things that's changed in sort of world historical terms. Don't mean to sound too grand, but it matters in the sense that the entire world had a second chance penal system until the middle of the 19th century. Because exile was a big part of it. It's why we have Georgia. It's why Australia exists, right? Those were all places that were populated by people who'd been convicted of something and were sent someplace else. And by the middle of the 19th century, the world was carved up in a way that was no longer possible. And so the project of thinking about criminal justice since then has been to figure out how to build an alternative approach to a second chance if you can't just let somebody move someplace else. The fact of the matter is that most violence comes out of networks of relationships. That is, it's a very small percentage of people who are pathologically violent. And so when people get to move out of a set of problematic relationships, they often do much, much better. And that's what sort of exile achieved. That's more or less what Germany and the Netherlands have succeeded in doing, is inventing a second chance system. And that's the way to think about it. And so you have to think about the work concept embedded in a second chance concept. Sort of convict labor that we had in the 19th century and early 20th century were never embedded in a second chance concept or framework. So the real question is, how do you anchor that ethical commitment in our society and in our institutions? And that would be a necessary thing to ensure that you don't revert to a sort of 19th century convict labor style thing. Okay, but then there's another thing to say here, which is that at the end of the day, we just have a heck of a lot more criminal sanctions than other countries, okay? And that brings me back to the war on drugs, all right? So the war on drugs has had a huge impact on the size of our criminal justice system in a number of ways. So I'm just going to go through some of the ways it's mattered. In the first instance, 14% of incarcerated people in federal prisons, or not just federal prisons, the whole structure, are nonviolent drug offenders. Okay? These are people who would not be incarcerated in other countries and whose wrongdoing, if what they did was still considered illegal, would be a misdemeanor, not a felony. All right? So in that first instance, that's a huge chunk of people. And often people will say to me, oh, you can't just think, ending the war on drugs would fix everything because all it will do is, take 14% of incarcerated people out of prisons. I'm like, I'll take 14%. Thank you. I'm not going to sniff at that. So, okay, let's start there. But that's not all by any stretch of the imagination. You have to then think about the question of what does it mean to have an illegal market on the scale that we have? Anybody know how much money Americans spend on illegal drugs? Okay. So every 3.5 days, we've spent another $1 billion. $100 billion every year. Now, how do you enforce contracts in a $100 billion illegal market? With guns. All right? It's very basic. Okay? So you cannot have an illegal market at that scale without significant violence attached to it. Right? So some significant portion of the violent offenses in our prisons also directly flow out of the fact that we have an illegal market of that scale. All right? Now then here's another wrinkle. Okay? The marijuana laws are changing. That's a very good thing from my point of view. But the laws that had been on the books could give people 1 year to 2 years for simple use and possession of marijuana, 1 year to 5 years for simple use and possession of crack or cocaine. Okay, and then of course there are the disparities between crack or cocaine. All right? Now, if those are your sentences for nonviolent activities that just harm the user, all the rest of your sentences have to get longer to make any sense in relationship to them. All right? So just that way of thinking about narcotics use has skewed our entire sense of what a proportional punishment is for something. Okay? One more little piece. So another thing that happens is, so in the middle of the 20th century, cities in America had what are called homicide clearance rates of about 90%. A homicide clearance rate is the rate at which a homicide case is closed by the police. Ideally by a conviction, not always. Sometimes cases just get closed, but nonetheless, a 90% clearance rate is a very good thing. It means the issue is done for whatever reason. All right? In major cities in America, Chicago's in a particularly bad way at the moment. Baltimore's in a bad way at the moment. LA's been bad. It's a little bit better now. But clearance rates have come down into the 30% range. In Detroit, before its bankruptcy, clearance rates were in the teens. All right? Now, two important things here. When police aren't able to clear homicide cases, comparative work in other countries in South America have shown that what you get is a phase shift up in the whole level of violence, not just because that means you have revenges or vendettas that are out there, but also actually because people know that if somebody's coming at them in a violent way, they're not going to have any recourse from the judicial system. And so in that kind of environment, the best defense is a strong offense. Everybody gets trigger happy, and you get an equilibrium shift. It's just a phase shift in the level of violence. All right, so low homicide clearance rates result in phase shift upward in level of violence. Now, where are those low homicide clearance rates coming from? Okay, because that's the important question if we're trying to trace a chain of related things. A part of the answer is prosecutorial workload. Okay? Prosecutors have, so in federal courts in a recent year, 32% of new cases were drug cases. Okay? That kind of imposition on prosecutorial workload means prosecutors don't have as much time to give to homicide cases. What police report is, as a result, prosecutors only want open and shut cases. And that, police argue, is one of the things that's keeping homicide clearance rates low. Do you follow that? In other words, so the point is that in addition to its other distortions, another thing the war on drugs is distorting is is where prosecutors spend their time and attention. Okay, instead of focusing on the big stuff that is most important to solidify a judicial system, they're focusing on this whole mess of drug cases. All right? So, in other words, and this is still, I know this is a long answer to one question, I apologize. I've gotten myself on a digression, but the point is just that we have to take a whole series of felonies out of our system also. And in my view, legalize marijuana and decriminalize other drugs by converting simple use and possession into misdemeanors as a part of a picture of transitioning to a reasonable criminal justice system. Sorry, I didn't mean to give you a second lecture.
I was just going to ask you, what's the relationship you see, since I don't know the history, the privatization of prisons and the, constructive criminal.
Yeah, I mean, privatization hasn't been good, and we've seen any number of cases of, yes, judges taking, in effect, bribes and siphoning people to private prisons. Private prisons produce a very bad incentive structure for what you're doing with a sanctioning system. I would not put privatization at the cause of our problem. And in fact, I mean, privatization is one of the responses to our problem. The system got so big that it was too expensive for states to deal with, and so they started looking for efficiencies, and that's what generated the privatization movement. So privatization is more of a symptom of our problem than a cause of our problem. Oh, you see, you thought it was going to be long again, so you're all like, I'm going to just wait, but no, aha.
Yeah, I was just wondering, so your cousin was incarcerated while you were already on your academic path, and I was wondering if at that time it had an impact on what you were thinking about what was more purely academic work.
That's a good question. So it's his experience shows up in my work all the way through, in the sense that, so my first book was about punishment in ancient Athens, but I actually, in the introduction, spent some time talking about the 3 strikes out law in California, because by that point he'd been sentenced. And so there are various ways in which I was sort of working on the problem all along the way. But one of the experiences, I've sort of, it's a strange thing, because I could see that the prison system was growing in this incredible way as a kid, right, in the late 80s and early 90s. And here it is, 2017, 18, right, and that's when I finally published a book on the subject, okay? And not only that, but my cousin died in 2009, so why did it take me 8 years to write this story? And, he was released in 2006, so in other words, why did it take me so long? And there are a number of answers to that question. The first of which is, there is an incredibly powerful motivation. When you're in the middle of a problem, you're just trying to fix that problem. And so all of our energy was directed at Michael, getting him through prison, helping him get the schooling, et cetera, planning for when he was going to get out, like trying to think about reentry, trying to put all those pieces together and so forth. And it's hard to, there's a kind of temporal mismatch between what you experience as a person inside of something and what the kind of macro policy details look like when you look back at them. And so I think that's sort of one of my lessons of the book, is that it's strange that it takes people as long as it does to understand where they are and what's happened to them. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly, but okay, yeah. Yes.
Is there anything else you would share with us about Karen? And I'm thinking, related to this question, how thinking through these things, how the visits together in the prison, how thinking about writing the book and telling Michael's story has changed the way you thought about her, and that,
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a nice question. There is something else, I guess, I would say, and maybe I can convey it by talking for a minute about the book's title. So the title's called "'Cause." I didn't take the time to explain that, because he's my cousin, right? Okay, that's obvious. And "'cause" means because, and so the book proceeds by way of answering questions like, why did he die? Why was he shot and killed? Why was he in prison for so long? And then the hardest question of all, why on earth did this beloved kid with a big extended family who cared about him end up on a street corner holding a gun trying to take somebody's car? And that's really a question about Karen too, right, fundamentally. As I was working on the book, after I drafted a whole first version of it, after that point, I learned something I had never known, which is that "'cuz" is also what members of the Crips call each other. Okay? Michael called me "'cuz." Okay? I didn't figure this, and he didn't call me "cuz" until when we were kids. That was a later thing he called me. I didn't figure this out until I was interviewing more family members, and another cousin who had also been in South Central but who had grown up there mentioned it to me. And I want to say two things about this cousin. One is that, well, what he said was, I grew up in a Bloods neighborhood, he said. And every time Michael called me cuz, he said, I noticed when he started calling me cuz, it was just before he went away. And every time he called me cuz, it made my blood curdle. And I didn't know why he was calling me that, because he knew I grew up in a Bloods neighborhood, and here he was calling me this thing that the Crips call each other. So two things to say there. I asked my cousin, grew up in the Bloods neighborhood, well, how come, you didn't get entangled in stuff? To which he said, I grew up there, and so everybody knew where I was from, so I didn't have to do anything to prove what my affiliations or alliances were. So I could just skirt around the edges of the place and be safe and get out. But Michael, who came in without affiliations, had to prove where he belonged. And that does seem to be what happened to Michael. That is, and it turns out it fits the literature about gang involvement and so forth, that kids start to get involved, and then about 18 months after they start getting involved, they have their first arrest. And it's very hard once you start getting involved to get out again. And that just basically is what happened to him. The crazy thing is that we didn't know that. It wasn't until I was working on this book that we figured that out, okay? And so how this comes back to Karen is that as I was working on the book, what I came to understand was that everybody had pieces and parts of the story of what had happened to Michael, but we had never all brought that to the surface, and that had blocked us from seeing the full story of what was happening. And similarly, when Karen had married this abusive man, we could see there was trouble, and she talked to my dad all the time. They're very close, but she never told my dad that she was being physically abused. There's sort of shame blocking people talking about things that matter, things that are hard, but things that matter. And so for me, one of the biggest lessons in the book is just this issue of needing to push the boulder of shame aside at every moment in a life so that you can actually talk about the hardest things and get the whole team of people together working on them. So that's what didn't happen, and the reason it didn't happen is because of the way in which shame creates silences. And so that's back to why did it take so long to write the book. Literally, Michael died, my family not once talked about what happened to him. We all just shut down. It was devastating for everybody. It wasn't about not caring. We cared deeply. We didn't talk. Even Michael's mom and siblings didn't talk to each other about what had happened. My interviewing my family was the first time ever that we did that. Thank you so much for your time and attention. That was all right? Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Thank you again for being here. You'll have a chance to speak with Dr. Allen during the reception, and I invite you to get something to eat and drink and mingle. Thanks again for being here. And thanks so much to you, Dr. Allen.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.